Hi everyone, and hope you're having a great afternoon. Welcome to our Angular migration journey. Please feel free to ask any questions during the presentation using the Q&A box, and we're gonna get to them at the end of our talk. Good. So I'm Alexandra. I've started the development part 8 years ago, and I've started as a full stack developer, mostly focused on .NET. And we're talking about Angular, right? But since 4 years ago, I think my main focus and when my energy is on the front end side, so I've came to the light, to the pretty part of the development. On a personal note, I really enjoy cooking. I think the best way to end a hardworking week is gather up with friends, enjoy a glass of wine, some good food, and talk everything out. And a fun fact about me is that I'm terrified of heights. And I'm not saying I'm afraid, I'm terrified, actually terrified. But one thing that's always been on my bucket list is to do a parachute jump. So fingers crossed I get to do this in this lifetime.
Nice. Hey everybody, my name is Alexandru. I'm also a software developer. I'm mostly a front-end developer, even though I dabble a bit into all of the other disciplines. I limited myself to JavaScript only, so backend for Node.js, that's my go-to. And I also enjoy working with Python in my free time. So doing all those DIY things in my home, I just go for Python. I'm a software developer for 4 years and a half now. And I started as an intern here, and then I just continue my journey along the way. One of my favorite pastimes, one of my favorite hobbies is playing video games. I'm a competitive person, and because of that, I always go for competitive games, like Counter-Strike, Dota 2, all that stuff. But when I try to chill out and just relax, I can go for casual games. I just don't have any kind of preference when that comes around. One of my favorite things to do is one of my hobbies actually is music. So I enjoy any kind of music. I don't have any preference on that part. I listen from classical to metalcore. And one of my hobbies or my pastimes as well is playing guitar. I have an acoustic, I have an electric, and I try to get a second electric now. And also I try to work a bit with the ukulele on that side. So strings everywhere. That's it for me. If we're gonna go for this presentation, we have a route, we have the journey that we have to take. So we'll have a couple of stops along the way. First things first, we'll talk about the pain points. Then we'll have a stop on the endorsing the journey and to see how can we make some allies and have another party with us. Then we're gonna talk about a bit about the technical implementation, the return on investment, and last but not least, the takeaway. So what can we get away with this migration? Okay, pain points. The biggest pain point is on the screen right now. We have an AngularJS end of life, and that's Angular 1, by the way. The end of life is at the end of this year. So 31st of December, 2021. Initially, it was scheduled for June or July 2021, but it has been pushed because of COVID and the pandemic. So the end of life is at the end of the year. Fitting, right? The countdown is going. It's still counting down. What happens with the end of life? First of all, we're going to have an end of support. So what this means, Angular and the Google team behind it will stop working on AngularJS, will stop working on fixing critical bugs and adding more functionality to this. So that's a pretty big warning sign. As I mentioned, no more updates. If something happens, if there's a critical vulnerability in a browser and Angular might need to do something about this, after the end of life, they will stop doing that. So that's also a big problem. The developer retention is also a big pain point because Angular is moving towards another direction right now. The developers will also try to keep up with the technology, will try to keep up with what's new. And when they hear about AngularJS in their projects, they're probably going to be a bit more skeptical at the beginning, and they will start to move out of it in the end. So the retention is a pain point, which leads us to higher costs. On our project, we might need higher costs to keep these developers on working for Angular. We might need higher costs to support some functionalities that will probably not have support from the Google team. So everything will go as a higher cost in the end. And the biggest problem is continuous technical debt. If we are going to have our project with AngularJS and we're going to keep adding functionality to it, along the way, during time, the technical debt will grow more and more and more, and it might need to, we might need to shift our attention to this and start migrating as fast as possible.
So after the Angular 2 version was announced, or Angular as we all know it, everyone who had their app in AngularJS reached the crossroad. And we're gonna share with you our experience with one small application built by one front-end developer in a smaller period of time. And on the other side, the dark side of the picture, is the big application that was built by an entire team. And it took pretty much, I think, 3 years before the Angular 2 was announced. Discussing with Alex, we figured out that we had pretty much the similar approach when it came to the when we heard the news, and it all started with the idea that we need to do something. So based on that, we gathered all the people with the interest in our app. We're talking about other developers. Even though they weren't front-end or focused on the web, I think it was a good way to see another perspective on things. Product owners, stakeholders, everyone that had something invested in our application was there, and we started the discussions. And you can imagine the first thing we did was a list with why we should migrate or not, and identify the risks, the risk of migrating and what could that introduce in our app, and the risk of continuing developing in AngularJS. Since we're talking about our migration story, the risk of keeping the AngularJS were larger than the other one. So we went for the migration part. And we also looked over the benefits, because doing the migration, we discovered that it's gonna add up on our app, and we're gonna have a new shiny thing at the end. And I think the most important part was to create the plan, because that's the key of having a successful story. For the bigger application, we had some time to test ideas, to test various scenarios. We had days to verify POCs and everything. And we really took our time to create this plan. And in the end, it paid off. So one of our advices would be to take your time with this process and not rush it, because I think it will add up in the end. And then we got to go back to our computers and do the job we love, right? And start migrating the code.
All right, let's get a bit more technical. Since we're in a technical presentation, let's talk about how we did this. First things first. We're going to talk about two different approaches, as Anda mentioned at the Crossroad. First one would be the all-in-one approach. And this was the plan that we had implemented as a team. So first, we had our Angular 1 application. It was already in place. We had a stable version of it. Everything was working fine. So what we decided to do is to create a different branch out of it and start tinkering and creating things on that different branch while keeping the Angular 1 stable and working as it was before. So what we did there, first things first, we did it incrementally. So we started the new application. We created everything. We took care of the configuration. And in this initial step, after we had this empty application with all the configurations needed, we added the needed routes. Routes to all of the pages and components that we had in the Angular 1 application. We made a one-on-one representation. After we had everything in place and we had the skeleton, as we say it, we started migrating pages one by one. And we started doing them based on the complexity. We started with the more easy ones, the less complex one, and then we went further on into the more complex and the bigger ones, let's say. After we migrated all the pages necessary, we started working on the more complex features, like let's say a graph or some sort of fancy table in there. All the things that we had in Angular 1, we had to migrate them as well to work in Angular 2+. After we had everything in place, we look at it and then, okay, let's start to integrate with what we had before. And we integrated it in the current infrastructure to see that everything is working fine in the infrastructures that we had with the previous application. We integrated the application with the CI/CD pipelines. So we took care of the Jenkins jobs that we had to work with the new application as well. And we also added all the other integrations that we had before. As an example, we had a tool that analyzed dependencies and vulnerabilities on these dependencies on our application. And we had to also plug it in the new app as well to detect all the vulnerabilities, of course. After everything was integrated and everything was working fine, we had a session of testing the new application to see if we can find new bugs. We can see if we can find any inconsistencies that we could find along the way. And after the testing team said, okay, it's fine. It's looking the same. It has the same look and feel. It might work faster. It could work faster. After everything was all right and we had the okay, we merged this new branch. We made this new branch as a stable one. And then we kept the old Angular 1 branch as a legacy, let's say, to keep it there and to take care in case we need to also do something with the application that was in production at that moment. So after everything was fine, make this one stable, and voila, we have the Angular 2+ application. This is the all-in-one approach. Okay, let's talk a bit about the challenges. Based on the poll answers that you guys answered, I can see that you have some experience with Angular 1. But for the people that don't have experience with Angular 1, these are one of the most used functionalities of Angular 1 that we had as developers. And basically, these are the root scope, which is something I'm going to talk about now, the broadcast and the watchers. So these are things that we find in Angular 1, but we don't find in Angular 2. So of course, when we migrated things, we started bumping into these. We started, okay, we have to do something to maybe migrate this as well somehow. So the root scope. The root scope is a global state in the whole application in which you can hold variables, in which you can listen to events that are globally or on the application, all of it. This doesn't really exist in Angular 2+. So as an example here is a piece of code. We're going to get a bit more technical this time. The first one is a variable which can be shared through all the components in Angular 1. And the broadcast and the on are events that you can broadcast and emit and listen to on this root scope, on this global state. And it kind of looks like this in Angular 1. This is kind of like you would use it. In Angular 2+, what I did back then when I migrated the application was, okay, let's create a new service, which we call it root scope because convenience, in which we can hold variables, in which we can have event emitters and all that. So we replicated this whole root scope concepts into a service, which kind of simulates root scope. And then we can have variables, we can have event emitters and all that. So you get the variable, you set the variable. Basically, it's a getter and setter if you want to do this being private. As for the event emitter, you had in the service an event emitter which can listen to and emit stuff. But in my components where I used this emitter and the broadcaster and the on, I just set the variable and I emit it on our event emitter, and it just triggers the event emitter. And in my other component where I want to make use of it, I subscribe to this one. And I see if my data is something that I want, I can do something. Pretty much, this is the new dynamic of it. As for the broadcast and the watch first. You could have watched something like variables if they changed in the scope of a component in Angular 1. And it works something like this. You had a scope of the component and you were watching a variable. If they have a new value and an old value. It was pretty simple. You could make use of this when you wanted to see if something changes really fast and you can make an action based on it. In Angular 2 plus, this doesn't really exist. There's no scoping like it has in Angular 1. So a solution back then was to use ngDoCheck. ngDoCheck is a lifecycle. I'm having a lapsus. It's an event in the lifecycle in which you can make use of, in which you can see all the changes that happens inside of your component. And as a workaround, I had to take care of remembering the old watch variable beside the new watch variable. And if they were equals, we don't want to do anything because ngDoCheck calls at every change detector a loop. So it calls really fast and a bunch of times. We don't want to do anything if it doesn't do what we want. So if it was equals, nothing changed, just return it, do something. And then if they weren't different, you can just remember the new variable as an old one and make the same verification later on. It's a workaround, but this was the solution that we came up to then. As a better solution, something that you might not want to use ngDoCheck because it calls so many times, is to make use of observables. Observables are intensely used in Angular 2+. And based on this event emitter, you could subscribe to this event emitter in the getter, and the getter will return an observable in which you can subscribe to and see if the value inside of it changed. It's exactly the same as if you used the watch in Angular 1, but you would need to use an external service for this. So this was the second and the more improved solution for the watcher in Angular 1, and it works like this. So you had the service before, and in our components, we subscribe to the getter. And if the data is what we want, we do something. If not, we just skip it. If you want to trigger this getter, you might also, after you set the variable inside of it, inside of the watcher, you also have to emit an event. So the getter knows that, okay, something happened, you might have to listen to this. The second challenge is something that we bumped to, and it's the promises versus observables. In Angular 1, it worked pretty well with promises, while in Angular 2, everything works pretty well with observables. An example to this are the API calls. So the HTTP client that we had in Angular 1, it would look like this. It would just return the getter, and in the controller, we just get it. And with a promise, then after it resolves, we can do something with the data that comes from the API. Pretty simple. In Angular 2+, the HTTP client is using observables, RxJS for this. It will look exactly the same in the service. You just return the HTTP method, get, post, whatever you have. And in your components, you subscribe to them, which makes sense. You would get the data, you subscribe to this stream, you would get the data that you want, do something with it. Makes perfect sense. What didn't make perfect sense when we implemented this is when we wanted to make a post or a put. We wanted to send something to the server. So we had an object and we posted this. Makes perfect sense in our situation. But in our component, when you wanted to do this, it didn't work because we didn't have the subscribe. Because back then it didn't make much sense that a post would have to subscribe to something that comes back. So it's something that the observables require you to do. It's something that might not be so intuitive at first, but after you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy and it's pretty straightforward.
So we got to the second approach. After all the challenges Alex already mentioned, I'm gonna mention some more, but let's start with the beginning. We started also, as Alex mentioned, with a stable application that was in production and it was running successfully, but it was in Angular 1, and we aim to have the same stable application, but in Angular 4, it was at the time when we started the migration. And for any person, this is the road, right? For getting from point 1 to A to point B, right? But since we're developers and we've been working in this field for a while, this is how the road translates to us. When we started talking about it, we realized that one of our main requirements is to be able to add new functionalities. We needed to stay relevant on the market. We couldn't afford to spend half a year, 3 months, just to migrate the app and afterwards have the same application and start the new development. Since we wanted to add new functionalities, we needed to have also the possibility to release them fast. And the features, the bugs, everything, we needed a way to get them to market as soon as possible. That led us to have a hybrid application. So an application that runs also Angular 1 and also Angular 2+. And you have modules that you're migrating them one step at a time. Meanwhile, you can add new functionalities and you can balance the work as you see fit for your application. But during the road, what we saw is that you need to have the automation part in place, or you're gonna spend some time and the fast releases that I was mentioning about and everything is gonna be a bit slowed down by testing, because you need to make sure that you're not introducing any issue. The main idea with having an app that runs both versions is that the users don't know which version is on what page. So you cannot afford to add bugs on places that were working before and you did no change from a user perspective. So that's why it's important to have this part covered, or at least to take into consideration the time when needed. And I was mentioning about new developments. Business requirements have more priority at times than the migration, because we're always wanting to improve functionally our app. So pieces of code and functionality that are not usually touched have the risk to stay up there, forgotten, and become legacy, because you have a pretty stable working app and you have places that run in AngularJS, and that doesn't affect anybody because you can migrate them at any time when you see fit. And you can prolong the hybrid app for a long time. First challenge that we had was the setup. So as I mentioned, we wanted to have an application that was running pages with Angular 1 in the latest version. And what was fit for us at that time was to have the app running in AngularJS context and using an NPM package and a hybrid router to help us route from each version, from the pages of each version. It took almost a sprint, if I remember correctly, to have the setup in place and have the app, the Angular bootstrapped from AngularJS, and have one page just running the new version of dummy page, a Hello World one. And that was the first challenge we encountered, the setup. So if you're gonna go with this approach, just take in mind and keep some time for the setup. Afterwards, migrating the code base, the same thing, in my opinion, no matter the approach you choose, because we encountered most of the challenges that Alex already mentioned, and I bet everyone that migrated the Angular 1 apps encountered them as well, because we were using the things that were available in that version, and we needed to move to the new one. Another thing we had, and we realized during the way, comes from a rule that we established in the beginning, that every page that gets migrated, it also gets improved. So we're going to spend the time to fix issues if they appear, if they are known or we see them. We're also going to spend a bit of time on UX and customize and improve the app. So while we were migrating pages and improving, or I don't know, fixing some things on a component, usually that component was used also in other pages in our app. So we were tempted to downgrade the new component, the Angular component, and use it in the AngularJS pages. And at the time, that led us to have pages that were having also components in AngularJS and Angular. And what we saw was a decrease in performance and some performance issues on this part, especially on the pages that had lots of data and data that you needed to customly show in a certain way, because the change section was running on both versions. So that forced us in a way to do better planning and to resist the urge to reuse things that we improve in other pages, but just plan better the pages and see where the components we're migrating or improving are used, and migrate a bunch of pages at a time. Or I don't know, sometimes there were needed changes in AngularJS just to make it similar. So yeah, I think that was a lesson learned for us from the road. And I think that adds up on the challenges and on the modular part approach.
All right. After the technical implementation, let's look at the return on investment. So what do we gain from doing this? We will look at the return on investment on the short term and on the long term. For the short term, we have, as Anda mentioned earlier, when you migrate things, you also improve it. So the app improvement is always there, because you can't just take a code that's working bad and just migrate it bad. You will ultimately improve it out of instinct, if not out of requirement. Another thing on short term is the market orientation. The web ecosystem changes really, really fast. It's always changing, actually. So with Angular being updated twice a year, it would be a pity to stay on Angular 1. So the market orientation will also be there when you keep the Angular migrated and keep Angular updated, with every major release. And last but not least, which is also very important, the team engagement, because they will, the new team that will work on Angular 2+ will be hyped because of the new technology and moving away from the old technology, and which will also increase the retention mentioned in the pain points. As for the long term, the most important thing on the long term is the business continuity, because if we migrate things, it will be kept up with the market orientation, will be kept up with the new things that come every year from the Web Consortium and the Google team that works on the business continuity, on the Angular. While if we have Angular 1 and things start to go bad and we have to make workarounds after workarounds after workarounds to to keep it working and stable, it might be bad for business continuity. So after migration, the business continuity will be all right and great. Less technical depth in there. Other benefits will be faster development, because it works fine with all the new modern editors that we have. It has TypeScript in there. It's really fast to develop new applications with Angular. It will have a better performance. Usually this is relative to your application, but on average, it has a better performance with the new Ivy compiler in Angular. Has a cleaner architecture, and that's also taking to TypeScript in there. And a better security, being updated, being kept updated every week, and also it's being open source. Everybody can contribute to this. Everybody can find vulnerabilities, and everybody can contribute to this. So the security will also be there, and it's going to be great.
So, what's the recipe, right? How do we start, and what are the bullet points we need to cross in order to have the perfect plan? In my opinion, and I think I'm speaking for Alex as well, is there's no perfect plan, and it's a combination of looking into your app, into your current state of the app, and knowing its strengths and its weaknesses. Also, just have a look on the future plans, because you may not have the luxury like Alex did to stop development and focus on migration. So maybe you need to find a new approach. But most importantly, I think it's the business context that you need to take into consideration. You have the team, you have the application, the clients and everything. And your main goal, from our opinion, is you need to make any change you consider in order to have the app relevant for a longer period of time. And adding up on technical depth, that's not going to be the reason. So I saw also on the poll that there are some people that are considering migrating from Angular 1 to Angular 2. Our advice would be to just don't rush it and take a moment to look at everything and find your perfect recipe, your perfect approach, because you may not go with Alex's one or with mine. Maybe you figure out that you can migrate to React or use micro frontends. I don't think there's one thing that you can do right. It's just a combination of factors. But most important is removing the technical debt, and then I think that will be the big plus on the run. So thank you, and also you have there on the card our contact details if you want to get in touch, talk some more, because it was a high overview of our progress. But if you want to, feel free to contact us anytime.
Okay, it's time for Q&A. So Q&A is still open. You can use the Q&A box if you have any questions. There's already one in here, and I will read it out loud. Did you encounter any challenges when it came to keeping the consistency in the UI when you had the same components in Angular 1 and Angular 2?
Yep.
I think this goes to you, Anda.
Yep, I was already answering it. I think that was one of the main the main challenges also from testing perspective, because our testers are always looking in all the places of the app and saying, oh, it doesn't look pretty much the same. And we needed to change. And it was, there were times that we needed to make changes in Angular 1, even though it was a rule that we're not going to change Angular 1, we're just going to migrate to Angular 2 and have everything there. But in order to keep the consistency and keep everything as smooth as possible, we did changes also style-wise, also some fixes that were mandatory to have also in Angular 1. So there were times, but I don't think that added up that much on the period of time that we developed when we doubled the work, let's say, because pretty much that's it.
All right, we have another question. How big were the applications you described in terms of number of screens and time of development? I can start on this one. So I was working on a small application that Anda mentioned on the Crossroad. It was pretty small. It had 4 to 5 different screens. They had some similarities in the components, so reusable stuff in each page, of course. So number of screens like 4 to 5, let's say 4. And the time of development, I'm not sure what you mean by this. Is the time of development for the migration itself or the time of development before the migration? The migration took, in my situation, both, thank you. In my situation, the migration took 4 sprints, 3 sprints for the actual migration. So that's 6 weeks, a sprint of 2 weeks, and 1 more sprint dedicated only to testing. So a total of 4 sprints. So that's 8 weeks. Before this, before the migration, I think we had the application developed for around a year and a half, let's say. I don't have the exact time frame, but I think it was around a year and a half. What about you, Anda?
On our side, it was an app started in AngularJS. So it was a startup in Angular that after 3.5 years, I think, that was the period of development before the Angular 2 breaking changes appeared. And it was developed by a pretty big team. I think there were times that 4 frontends were working on the app. And a number of screens, there are too many to number, but we had different modules, lots of configurations, lots of ways to display the data. And there were thousands of lines of code, pretty much. I don't have the exact number, but it's a pretty big application. Development for the migration part, actually having the hybrid part, and if you remember the legacy icon that I showed you, it's still in progress, the migration. We have 60% of it migrated, and anything that we added as a new feature, it's in Angular 2, but from the old code, I'm almost 40% they are still in AngularJS.
There's one other question in the chat this time. Could you share some useful tricks or materials to read about migration between 2+ versions? For example, migrating from Angular 6 to Angular 10. Usually, if you want to migrate from one version of Angular 2+ to another version of Angular 2+, you can make use of the tool made from Angular, which is you can find it on upgrade.angular.io if I'm not mistaken, but I can come up to you later and give you the link for this. You can just look it up. It's very, very useful. It goes step by step. It tells you, it has a bit of a tips and tricks in there. It tells you not to migrate from 6 to 10 directly, but to 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9, and so on. So if you follow that, based on your complexity, you can also have configurations based on complexity of application. If you use this, if you use that, it's very complete. It's very useful. So
we actually did the migration for 2 versions, and we used this one, and it worked pretty fast. But we migrated from one to another, and afterwards from another directly.
We have 1 more minute. So if there are any other questions, I don't see any other questions. There is actually 1 more question, but there's 1 more minute left. Do you think Angular upgrade static will be available in 2-3 years from now? Let's answer this and then let's close the session. Angular upgrade static. I didn't use Angular upgrade, so I think you did.
Yeah, I'm not sure about 2-3 years from now, because since AngularJS is out of life, but yeah, for 2-3 years, yeah, I think not everyone has the chance to migrate. So yeah, it's gonna be, but for 5-6 years, I don't think so. So I think it's gonna be at one moment in time, it's gonna be out, or not out, but not updated anymore.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for participating to our webinar.
Thank you.
And enjoy the next ones.
Yep.
A great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.